Okay, this video is called How to Attract a Woman, and GSA2 is just a mnemonic to remember this stuff, sort of the requirements of this. And a good way to view it is kind of like a game, because if you view it that way, you'll learn how to play it and be nonchalant and indifferent about it, and it ends up being useful. So the first G is for game, and game just means knowing how to talk to women. Talking to women is totally different than talking to a guy. When you talk to a guy, you just have a conversation. Whatever they say is what they mean, almost always. You don't even need to look at them. I can understand every single thing a guy is saying to me just from hearing his voice. With a woman, you want to see her face if possible, because they make all kinds of facial expressions, and it's hard to know what they really mean if you don't see their face. That's why a woman always has an advantage on a telephone, because your voice as a man tells her everything you're saying, versus with her, you can't see her face, so you really don't exactly know where she's coming from a lot of times. Let's see. For beginners, some guys are really kind of clueless, because a lot of times men lead very narrow lives. I was that way when I was young. All I did was wrestle and study, pretty much. Not much more than that. So if you're really a rookie, read things like How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And a lot of times nowadays, you don't even need to buy a book. You just watch all the videos. There's tons of videos about all these topics on the internet. A more intermediate level thing would be to read things about body language, because that's another thing too. Body language, a lot of men don't know it that well. Women tend to learn stuff at a much younger age than men do as far as social things are concerned. I had that experience too with my daughter. My sons would run around kind of like dogs, like wild animals, and I didn't really pay that much attention to them. Versus my daughter, for example, I'm lifting weights and I'm grimacing as I'm trying to lift a weight, and she's like, "Daddy, why are you mad?" She actually paid attention to my face. That would, at a very young age. I don't know how old she was, like 5 years old or something. Whereas a boy, it'd be a miracle for a boy to have any social insight at the same age. Things to learn from these body language books is IOIs and IODs, meaning indicators of interest, indicators of disinterest. And that's very useful to be able to quickly understand, because lots of times women will not say a single word. They'll just look at you and they expect you to know, but either you do or you don't. And you have to tell, just by how she looks at you, you could tell, does she want to talk to you or not? Is she interested in you or not? And so that's kind of a nice thing, because you avoid all the words. And with the words, you can act like if there's words, then it's almost like something happened. But if there's no words, then it's like nothing happened. But still, acceptance or rejectance or whatever all happened without any words. So being able to read them quickly is a very valuable thing. I think this book, Charisma Myth by Cobain, is quite good on those issues. I remember speaking to some technologists, many years ago. I'm like, "Hey, I read this really interesting book about body language," and they all started laughing at me. They're like, "Oh, we knew all that stuff. We've known that stuff for 15, years or more." So I thought that was kind of funny. Women who I was much more educated than, but they just knew all this stuff. In general, women get social stuff better than men. I joke that a dog has better social skills than a 20-year-old man. It understands a lot of things. Okay, and more advanced stuff. I think the book called The Mystery Method by Mystery is worth reading. Yeah, I'm not saying I believe everything in these books. This guy's like 6'5" tall. Okay, so a tall guy, women like tall guys, so he claims that he has all these methods, and a lot of it's just because he's tall. But it's still good, and it's funny because he went around dating all these women and spoke about his experiences. Versus if you read the book by these university guys are so narrowed by their having to remain within the confines of the way universities think. Universities try to pretend men and women are the same, which obviously they're quite different in their personalities and their approach to relationships, okay? Versus the mystery method just said whatever he thought was his experience. So again, I don't agree with all the things this guy says, but he's very insightful, and he has a whole vocabulary. Like AFC means average frustrated chump. PUA is pickup artist. So it's kind of funny, it's kind of vulgar, but it's very direct, and it's useful to be able to understand that whole vocabulary and mindset. There's a difference too between getting a date versus maintaining a relationship, okay? Maintaining a relationship, you kind of really know each other, so you can't fake who or what you are. You have to be what you want to be. You have to make yourself into that. And with a woman, there's a whole way of talking to a woman, because with a man, you just talk and there's nothing at stake, okay? You don't care about him. He doesn't care about you. You're just discussing a topic. Versus a woman, she immediately puts you through this entire, psychological analysis Are you safe? Are you dangerous? Are you sane? Are you crazy? Are you hitting on me? Are you just talking to me? Why are you talking to me? So there's all this stuff going on, and it happens real fast, and she's really good at that. Women are great at this sort of thing. So you have to be able to understand her just by how she's looking and how she's talking and the intonation of her voice. It always begins that way with a woman, this quick psychological analysis of you. So you just have to, like, be nice, be kind of like indifferent, and act like you don't care. It's weird, but you have to do all that stuff. Otherwise, she'll immediately, like, give you this IOD, indicator of disinterest. You're annoying. I don't want to talk to you. Don't waste my time. And it's understandable, too, because women are used to guys talking to them and wasting their time. You know, it's like, how does a man walk down a hallway? A man walks down a hallway looking, is there anybody I can talk to? Whereas a woman walks down a hallway staring at her phone because she doesn't want anybody bothering her, wasting her time. She's got things to do that day. Okay, status. It's real important. Women are kind of like Darwinistic. They want a guy who's high status in some way. She has to be comfortable bringing you in front of her parents, in front of her friends. So if you're an embarrassment to her in any way, then she's not going to want you around, you know. And so you have to, you know, everybody's successful and good and high status in their own particular area. So you need to figure out what that is for you. Like in high school, it's good to be a good athlete. That's a very high status thing in high school, but it's hard to be a good athlete at the college level or beyond that. So seek an environment where you stand out in some way. You know, like if you're a good dancer, go to a place where dance is relevant. All right. Being wealthy always impresses women. You know, Rodney Dangerfield used to say there's no such thing as an ugly rich guy. So I would actually say it's a very useful thing to kind of dress rich and act rich a little bit in a sense. And I say that because when I was at Stanford, I lived in the fraternity where all the best athletes lived. You know, guys that were pro football superstar players and all this stuff, and who became pro stars. And so basically, in high school, that would have been high status. But at Stanford, there was sort of an attitude that football players and wrestlers are thugs. Why do they even have athletic scholarships for them? There was incredibly low interest in this. Compared to like my friends who went to state schools, there were a lot of people, you know, they were kind of like little minor celebrities on campus, and they had no problem having girlfriends. It was easy for them. Versus at Stanford, I knew all these guys. Most of them didn't have girlfriends. That's what it was like at Stanford. There would be articles in the newspaper at Stanford saying, yeah, why should we give scholarships to these thugs, you know? Anyways, what happens for most guys, you know, academics is a path to better careers, but anything, it doesn't matter what you do. Anything that makes you wealthy is impressive to women. But one thing I noticed was all of the athletes would typically just wear t-shirts. They didn't care how they dressed. You know, often their t-shirt would say something about their sport. You know, wrestlers all wore t-shirts at wrestling tournaments, for example. That did not impress women at all. Because I remember this one fraternity, and we kind of looked at them as being really wimpy and nerdy, and we felt there was nothing distinguishing or impressive about them whatsoever. And these guys all would wear a shirt with a collar. And I remember we one time went to a party. Somehow they were there or was there. I don't remember all the details of it. But what I remember was all these guys, most of these guys had like nice girlfriends. And what I'm basically saying is, and a lot of them were dating girls from Stanford too. The girls were attracted to them because they seemed rich. They dressed nice. We were sort of, in comparison to them, we dressed like a bunch of thugs. We were always just wearing t-shirts, and I noticed that, and that actually left a big impression on me. I've had the experience now. I'm an old man. If I always dress nice. I usually won't leave my house if I don't have a tie. At least wear a tie, if not a suit, because I know you just get treated a lot better. That people immediately judge you, form an opinion of you. You know, it's not right or wrong. It's just how it is. And you know, you're not intrinsically that attractive when you're an old man. Okay, so if you're at least dressed nice and they think, oh, you're a respectable citizen, or whatever it is, you get treated much better. There's an obvious big difference. And again, it doesn't matter where your wealth comes from, you know, owning real estate. Also, if you can give the woman a job, she wants to be confident you could buy her a house, a place to live. Because what she's thinking is, if she's going to ever get involved with you or marry you or have kids with you, you got to be able to financially support her. You got to be able to provide her with a house for you and the kids and all that stuff. So she's going to assess that. And if you're going to maintain a relationship, you're going to have to be able to handle that aspect of it. You know, it's fun in high school where your parents are paying the bills, providing the food, there's no rent or anything. So all you can do is just enjoy each other's company. And if it doesn't work out, you break up. But it's not like that when you're older. When it's older, there's this big financial component to it. Will you be able to support me? Will you be willing to do that? Are you just going to run off on me? Are you reliable? So there's kind of like you have to go through all this stuff. And she's going to like check you out. The other thing too is I've noticed is women are much better at figuring out a man than a man is at figuring out a woman. By that I mean is a woman will come at you like 20 questions in 5 seconds. Where do you work? Where are you from? Blah, blah, blah. What nationality are you? All these questions. And it's like, and whereas like a guy, like I've noticed too, like when in my different jobs over the course of my life, I could work with a guy year after year and not know almost anything about him. I don't really care, as long as we are able to get along and get the work done. Maybe we'll have a laugh or two if there's something funny. But I really don't care about his personal life. We just don't. I mean, if it comes up, maybe it'll come up in conversation. People ask me what should they feed their kids, for example, what I think is the best sport for a kid, all that kind of stuff. But in terms of just the difference, I mean, like with a woman, they'll ask me, how old are your kid? Is it a boy or a girl? What's the kid doing? What's the kid studying? Women, in my experience, they tend to like suck all this information out of you. They want to know everything about you. It's almost like they've got this entire detailed social map of people they know around them compared to what men do. I'm pretty oblivious. Like for example, I noticed, just this morning, my wife by 9 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday had called 2 people and spent most of her morning on the phone and continued that most of the morning. And she'll do that all the time. A lot of women that I've seen do that all the time. Me personally, I haven't made a single phone call this entire month. 0. Other than, when I'm at work, I have to do work-related stuff. But intrinsically, in my entire life of knowing my father, I never once ever saw him pick up a phone and call somebody for a social reason. 0. Anytime we had parties at our house, which we actually did a couple times a year, my mother always called all his friends. She had all the phone numbers of all his friends and their families and knew all their families, knew all their children, everything about them. My father was totally oblivious. Never once made a social phone call in my entire many decades of knowing him. And he was a nice guy, but he was not intrinsically overtly social. And I think men in general, I mean, there's exceptions and there's variety and all that, but we're kind of like that. I'm like that too. I could easily go a month and not call a single person on a phone. Easy. Let's see, what else? Appearance. If you're lucky enough to be born tall or very good looking, that's the easiest way to be more attractive. But I think for any guy, you want to be thin. You don't want to be fat. Being fat is very unattractive in a man or a woman. You want to be, fit, muscular tone. So you should be lifting weights of some sort. Eating a healthy diet will keep you healthy for a long time because lots of guys, men and women, start getting fat after 40 or sooner. So you want to be well-groomed, dressed kind of wealthy. Like I said, I won't go outside without a tie on, and often I'll wear a suit if I'm going to go outdoors anywhere. Access. Now, here's what I actually think is the most important thing about this little talk here today that you will not necessarily find on other places if you read about this, listen about it. What I would say is the most important thing for attracting women is being around them. Now, I know that sounds obvious, but it's not. For example, I never thought about attracting women at Stanford. When I was in high school, there were lots of girls around. I knew them, and I had girlfriends quite often that were very, very nice, okay? But at Stanford, it wasn't like that. It was like being a wrestler meant nothing. It was like less than 0 social status. And so what I'm saying is, this is one of the most common mistakes for men is to not be aware of this because men often get very busy with their jobs. And there's lots of jobs where you don't talk to a single person. And then also where you go to school. So Stanford was like one of the worst places in the world to date women. Then when I went to medical school, I went at a medical school that was in inner city, a really bad neighborhood. And it's very common that medical schools are in inner city bad neighborhoods. And so there were 0 social events the entire year. At Stanford, there was like a party once every 4 months with the social circles I knew. And maybe you would go or maybe you wouldn't even go. There was you could bank on there being almost 0 social activity. Okay, then the next thing is what about and I was living with the best athletes, future, pro athletes, okay, some of them. And that's what I'm trying to say. There was no social life. I mean, there would be like the one party once every 4 months, whoop-de-doo. Versus you go to a state school, there'll be bars open, 6 nights a week. And they're going out all the time. Okay, Stanford, they're studying. All right, let's see, what else? Then if you go to school, in these big schools, they're very impersonal. So once I went back to Chicago area after being out in California, I went to this medical school in sort of an inner city area, and there were no social events. 0. There were never any parties. There was never anybody inviting people to their house. Most of them lived in small apartments or they lived with their parents, but there were no social events. I mean, there might be like end of the semester or some award ceremony or something, whoop-de-doo. There was really nothing social, zero. Everyone's scared to go out at night. And same thing with my residency. Residency was a little better. As a resident, I had a little bit of status, but still not that much. And I was a little bit surprised by all of this. And if I had to do it all over again, I would have planned, because I always just took for example that my social life would be good. And I also took it for granted that I would be wealthy. I was like, my dad's a doctor. He's real wealthy. I'm twice as smart as him. So I'll be wealthy. I won't even have to do anything. I'm just going to be a great doctor. I won't even have to think about it. It'll be automatic. So I didn't really plan things, which was stupid on my part. I was sort of like smart in school, but stupid at other things. And I would get teased about that with my family. For me, being smart was like one of the things I had going for me. There's plenty of other things I don't have going for me, but that would be one way, like for me, that I would sometimes date women because of that. Like one time there was a girl, a lady doctor who I wasn't in her field, but I was interested in her field. So I read all the journals in her field, and I sensed what was going to be the big thing for the next national meeting. So I actually wrote her paper, and she won this big award at the national meeting, big blue ribbon. And so I go to the meeting then to see the poster presentation, and I see this award, the paper that I wrote, the whole thing, my idea from the start, the whole thing. I came up with how to demonstrate all the MRIs and all this stuff of her field, the pathology in her field, and my name wasn't on it. And she's like, well, it's better if your name's not on it. You got the best deal out of anybody. You got to sleep with me. And I'm like, so I really didn't care. I actually was happy with that deal. But what I'm trying to say is, you got to use what goes for you. If you don't have other skills or other things, use whatever you got, because that's what'll work for you. Let's see. So go where the women are. So what I mean by this is, you can't date a woman if you don't talk to her. So you have to be around them. And there's not that many women around lots of places. For example, I work as pretty much a high-tech doctor nowadays. I'll say hi to one secretary. I'll go into a work area, and I'll just work. I won't speak to a single woman all day long. Okay. And also, you can't date women from wherever you work, because if you date a woman where you work, the old saying, don't do what where you work, because that could lead to problems. So basically, all of those women are off limits. So it has to be women who are not related to your corporation, whatever that might be. Now, a lot of people tell me, like the nurses and stuff, they say the internet is the place to meet women. But it's also kind of dangerous, kind of like the Wild West. How do you know who you're talking to? But that seems to be the big thing of the present and the future. All right, so anyways, this was the big thing I said, was just plan where you're at. Because if you don't think about it, you might be amazed. I was shocked. I just took all these things for granted. I was shocked that here I am just sitting in my dorm room, and there's no potential. Like I didn't have a girlfriend for 4 years straight at Stanford, not one. I mean, I stayed with my high school girlfriend for a year or so, long distance girlfriend, but after that, none. And then in med school, I don't think I dated a single girl in med school. No, I briefly once got back together with an old high school girlfriend, but that was it. And then I briefly had this one affair with this lady professor in my senior year, but I spent most of my time alone, not wanting to be alone. And it was just because of where I was at, and I didn't know anybody. So what I'm saying is, if you know somebody, your friend will introduce you to somebody. Your friend will give a recommendation, because, girls are scared of talking to some stranger guy. So basically, if you know a lot of people, you're part of the in-group, you'll be introduced to each other, and that'll make it just happen naturally, like it did in high school. But unless you plan for that, you could find yourself very isolated. I was shocked how isolated I was during my younger years for a prolonged amount of time. All right, here's Oscar Wilde quotes, and then we'll let this talk go. There is one thing infinitely more pathetic than to have lost the woman one is in love with, and that is to have found her and found out how shallow she is. And then another quote from Oscar Wilde: all married men are their wife's property. So anyways, some other day we'll talk about marriage. So anyways, hope that was useful.